The Belgian Malinois had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 explosions, and a gunshot wound to the shoulder. He had worked with Navy SEALs, Delta operators, and classified units whose names never appeared in any public record. He had been trained to trust only one handler at a time, and that loyalty, once broken, was never rebuilt. So when the dog walked across the lobby of a mid-sized veterans hospital in the middle of a Tuesday morning and sat down directly at the feet of a blonde nurse in wrinkled blue scrubs, a woman nobody in that building had ever considered remarkable, every person who witnessed it felt something shift in the air. Something wrong. Something they couldn't name. Then she whispered a word that wasn't on any file. And the most decorated military working dog in the Western Fleet lowered his head like he'd finally come home. Before this story pulls you somewhere you're not ready to leave, hit that subscribe button right now, because every week this channel drops stories that will stop you mid-breath. Tap like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The transfer paperwork arrived at Cascade Point Veterans Medical Center at 6:54 on a Tuesday morning, 48 minutes before the nursing shift change, and the charge nurse on duty, a methodical woman named Harriet Odom, who had been managing morning handoffs for 11 years, read the first line twice before she called the director's office. The patient wasn't a veteran in the traditional sense. I wasn't presenting with a gunshot wound or a prosthetic fitting or the particular kind of exhausted blankness that many long servicemen carried into the clinic like luggage they'd stopped trying to unpack. The patient listed on the transfer order was a Belgian Malinois, male, 7 years old, designated service animal, attached to Naval Special Warfare Command, cleared for veterinary trauma care at civilian facilities under a protocol most of the staff had never heard of. And the accompanying handler was a Navy SEAL captain named Dorian Voss. Harriet looked at the paperwork again. Then she looked at the intake coordinator, a 26-year-old named Brendan who was still holding his coffee cup with both hands. "Get Dr. Rutherford," she said. "He's not in until 8. Then get whoever's in charge of this floor right now." Brendan looked uncertain. "That's technically Dawson." Harriet paused. "The nurse?" "She's covering until the senior staff arrive." Harriet set the paperwork down with the particular deliberateness of someone choosing not to say what they were thinking. Mara Dawson had been employed at Cascade Point for just under 3 years. She was competent, quiet, and possessed a quality that many of the senior physicians found faintly irritating. She rarely deferred to rank, not out of arrogance, but out of a focused directness that read differently depending on who was on the receiving end of it. The doctors who liked her called it efficiency. The ones who didn't called it something else. "Fine," Harriet said. "Let her handle intake, but I want Dr. Rutherford paged the moment he walks in." Mara was in the secondary supply room when Brendan found her. She was restocking IV kits with the systematic calm of someone who had learned to use quiet moments to stay ahead of the inevitable rush, and she listened to Brendan's summary without stopping what she was doing. "Military working dog," she said. "Handler is active SEAL? Captain, apparently. What's the dog's condition?" Brendan looked at his notes. "The transfer order says post-surgical recovery from a shoulder injury sustained during active deployment. Vet cleared him for continued monitoring but flagged behavioral difficulties. Says he's been refusing standard handling protocols since the surgery and that the captain insisted on personal transport." Mara set down the IV kit. "What kind of behavioral difficulties?" "It's not really specific, just says he's—" Brendan hesitated. "Uncooperative." She looked at him. "That's not a clinical description." "I know. That's what it says." Mara pulled off her gloves, tucked the supply clipboard under her arm, and walked out of the room. The lobby was not yet crowded. Tuesday mornings had a particular texture at Cascade Point, slower than Mondays, still catching its balance before midweek pressure arrived. The morning light came through the east-facing windows in long, flat lines that lit up the dust on the front desk partition and made the linoleum look almost warm. Dorian Voss was standing near the entrance when Mara came through the corridor door, and she cataloged him in the quick automatic way she cataloged everyone who entered her care environment. Tall, mid-40s, the kind of physical condition that didn't come from a gym, jaw carrying 3 days of growth that looked less like a style choice and more like something forgotten. His left arm bore a half-healed abrasion along the forearm that hadn't been properly dressed. He held a cracked leather leash in his right hand. At the end of the leash stood the dog. The Malinois was muscular, scarred across one flank, moving with a slight favoring of his left rear leg that suggested the shoulder surgery had thrown off his compensatory gait pattern. His ears were forward. His attention was precise and fast-moving, tracking every person in the lobby with the focused wariness of an animal that had spent years in environments where inattention had consequences. Then the dog's gaze found Mara. It stopped. Not the slow assessment she'd expected, not the territorial stiffness she'd seen in other working dogs brought to civilian facilities. It stopped the way something stops when it recognizes something it was not expecting to find. Dorian noticed immediately. His grip on the leash tightened. Mara crossed the lobby toward them at the same steady pace, neither hurrying nor slowing, and she was close enough to read the wear on Dorian's boots before he spoke. "You're the intake nurse?" "I'm covering until the senior physician arrives at 8. She looked at the dog. "What's his name?" "His working designation is Bravo November 7. The handlers call him Flint." She looked at the dog, not at Dorian. "How long since the surgery?" 6 days. "And he's been rejecting handling protocols since when?" Something in Dorian's posture changed. Not a softening, more a recalibration, the slight adjustment of someone reassessing a conversation that was going differently than they expected. "Day 2 post-op," he said. "Wouldn't let the facility vet approach without becoming a liability. Wouldn't eat unless I fed him directly. Hasn't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch." "Any former handlers in contact during that period?" Dorian was quiet for one beat. "What makes you ask that?" "Because what you're describing isn't a pain response, and it isn't post-surgical anxiety. It's attachment disruption." She finally looked at him. "If he bonded to someone who's no longer accessible, the surgery and the unfamiliar facility probably accelerated an existing stress response. Pain management alone won't touch it." Dorian Voss, who had survived 2 overseas deployments and 1 classified operation that had never made it into any official documentation, was quiet for 2 seconds. Then the dog walked forward, not toward Dorian, away from him. The leash pulled taut, then went slack as Dorian let it extend, because Flint was moving with a purpose that was so sudden and so specific that stopping him would have required a physical correction that nobody in that lobby was going to apply to a post-surgical animal. He crossed the 12 feet of open floor between Dorian and Mara in a direct line and sat down, not beside her, against her leg. The lobby was quiet. Brendan, who was still standing near the desk, looked like he wasn't sure whether to document this. Mara looked down at the dog. He was looking up at her with the particular attention of an animal that has made a decision. She said quietly and without performance, "Rook." The word was barely audible. It wasn't a command. It was something lower than that. The particular timbre of recognition, the sound of someone speaking a name they hadn't said aloud in years. Dorian Voss's face went very still. He had been given Flint's full service history before accepting this assignment. He had read every handling report, every deployment note, every veterinary record going back to the dog's initial training assessment. He knew every designation Flint had carried. Rook was not in any document he had ever read. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was flat and careful. "I didn't hear it," Mara said. "I used it." Dr. Garrison Rutherford arrived at the hospital at 7 minutes past 8 and was informed by 3 different people before he reached the elevator that there was a situation in the intake corridor involving a military handler, a classified working dog, and Mara Dawson. He used the word situation with a particular emphasis that made Brendan step back slightly. Rutherford was the hospital's deputy medical director, a position he had held for 6 years and intended to hold for 6 more before moving to a consulting role that had already been quietly discussed with the board. He was precise about hierarchy, precise about protocols, and had a long-standing professional discomfort with ambiguity that expressed itself as brisk administrative action whenever something fell outside established procedure. He found Mara in the intake exam room with Flint and Dorian Voss. She had done a preliminary assessment of the dog's shoulder, not a formal clinical examination, which would require the attending veterinary specialist they'd had on call since the transfer order arrived, but the kind of hands-on observation that told her things the paperwork didn't. Dawson. Rutherford's voice carried the particular authority of someone who believed the sound of their own name usage conveyed rank. "What exactly is the situation here?" "Captain Voss transferred his dog for post-surgical monitoring. I'm doing intake assessment." "You're a nurse. not a veterinary professional. The dog's primary presenting issue isn't veterinary, she said. It's behavioral. The surgical site is healing within normal parameters based on visual assessment. His breathing is normal. His gait compensation is consistent with the recovery stage. What he needs right now isn't another clinical exam. It's a stable environment. Rutherford looked at Dorian. Captain, I apologize for any confusion. We'll have our veterinary specialist. She's right, Dorian said. Rutherford paused. I've watched Flint interact with 8 different specialists in 6 days, Dorian said. I know what his threat response looks like. He's not in threat response right now. He looked at Mara. I don't know what she did, but I'd like her to continue doing it until someone can explain to me what she did. Rutherford's expression was the careful arrangement of someone choosing not to argue in front of a Navy captain. I'd like a word with Nurse Dawson outside. In the hallway, he closed the door with deliberate quietness. This is outside your scope. I'm aware. The liability exposure alone, if that animal, he's not going to injure anyone. He's recovering from surgery and he's stressed. The appropriate response is to minimize stimulation, maintain familiar contact, and build a calm baseline before introducing additional handlers. Your expertise in military working dog psychology is based on what exactly? Mara looked at him. On experience, I'm not going to summarize in a hallway. That was the wrong answer for Rutherford. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, not because the response was rude, which it wasn't, but because it assumed a weight that he had not authorized her to carry. She had worked with him long enough to understand the architecture of his discomfort. He didn't object to competent staff. He objected to staff who moved in spaces they hadn't been given permission to enter, even when the space was clearly theirs. I'm removing you from this case, he said. I'll have Dr. Lashley cover intake from here. Dr. Lashley works trauma on the 3rd floor. She has 4 patients this morning. That's not your concern. Captain Voss came here because this facility was recommended for capacity and specialized care. If we fragment the intake process on day 1, we're going to have an incident before noon. I said I'm removing you from... The door opened. Dorian Voss stood in the doorway. He looked at Rutherford with the particular absence of expression that reads, in certain contexts, as more dangerous than anger. Is there a problem with her assignment? Rutherford gathered himself. Standard protocol requires that... I don't care about standard protocol. Dorian's voice was level. That dog has not been calm since the surgery. He's calm right now. The first question I have is why, and the second question is whether whatever is happening in that room is going to continue. He looked at Mara. Are you being removed from my dog's care? Before she could answer, Rutherford said, We're simply ensuring appropriate yes or no. The silence in the corridor had a weight to it. It's Dr. Rutherford's call, Mara said. He's the medical director. Dorian turned to Rutherford. The assessment in his gaze was unhurried and complete. Then I need you to understand something, he said. I drove 11 hours to bring that dog to this facility because I was told it was the best option. The transfer order is signed at a level that means if I pick up my phone and tell my commanding officer that the intake process here is interfering with my animal's recovery, this facility's status as an approved military transfer site gets reviewed. He paused. I'm not making a threat. I'm describing consequences. Rutherford's expression did something complicated. She stays on the case, he said finally, and walked back toward the elevator with the dignity of someone who had decided to frame their retreat as a strategic withdrawal. Mara spent the rest of the morning with Flint in the recovery suite they'd cleared on the 2nd floor. She didn't push contact. She sat in a chair 6 feet from the dog's padded rest station, reading through the surgical report on the shoulder, making notes, letting Flint habituate to the sound of her breathing and the particular stillness of her presence. Dorian sat near the window, watching with the quality of attention of someone who had learned that watching without interfering was a skill distinct from passivity. At 11:15, Flint got up from his rest station and moved to a point directly between them and lay down. He's mediating, Mara said. He's done that before, Dorian said, in the field. 2 handlers who weren't working well together. He'd position himself so they both had to focus on him instead of whatever was breaking down between them. He learned it or he figured it out. The trainers would say he learned it. I think he figured it out and decided it was useful. Mara looked at the dog. Flint's eyes were half closed, but his ears were tracking the room. The muted sounds of the corridor outside, the mechanical breath of the ventilation, the measured quiet of the conversation above him. He wasn't always called Flint, she said. Dorian was quiet. In his original handling documentation, she said carefully, not looking at Dorian, before the designation system changed, he was called something different. How do you know about the designation system change? She didn't answer that. Dawson. Dorian's voice had a different quality now, not hostile but sharpened. That information is classified at a level that a civilian nurse at a veterans hospital doesn't have routine access to. No, she agreed. They don't. The word they settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. Dorian stood up slowly. He looked at her the way people look at something familiar in a place where it shouldn't be. The particular dislocation of recognition without context. You knew him before, he said, before he was Flint. Mara looked at the dog. Flint had lifted his head. He was watching her with the same absolute attention he'd given her in the lobby. That unambiguous, unsettling certainty of an animal that knows something the humans in the room are still working toward. His former handler, Dorian said slowly, before the designation change, before the unit was restructured, there was a medical specialist attached to the team. He stopped. The color had shifted in his face, not dramatically, but enough. They told us she was transferred, that she'd left the program. Mara said nothing. Nobody leaves that program, Dorian said. Not the way they described. And Flint, he stopped again. For 2 years after the restructuring, Flint would sometimes stop mid-patrol and look in a direction that didn't make tactical sense. The handlers thought it was a training artifact, a glitch. He was staring at her now. He was looking for someone, Dorian said. Flint stood up. He walked to Mara's chair and put his head against her knee with the absolute trust of an animal that has made a decision it does not need to reconsider. Dorian and Voss had been in situations where the ground shifted beneath a certainty he'd built his understanding on. He knew the feeling. It was never comfortable, and it was never small. Your name isn't just Dawson, he said. What was your designation? The door to the recovery suite opened. Doctor. Rutherford stood in the doorway, and behind him was a man Mara had not seen in 4 years. A man in civilian clothes who was nonetheless carrying himself with a bearing that had nothing civilian about it. He was holding a folder, and the expression on his face when he found her was the expression of someone who had been looking for something for a long time and had stopped expecting to find it. Nurse Dawson, Rutherford said, with the tight satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to use a specific tone of voice. It seems you have some explaining to do. The man behind him said nothing. He was looking at Mara the way you look at someone you thought was gone, and Flint, pressed against her leg, was perfectly still. The man in civilian clothes was named Theo Bracken, and Mara knew him the way you know someone who is present during the worst night of your life. Not with warmth, not with hostility, but with the particular clarity of a memory that had never softened with distance. He had been a naval intelligence liaison attached to her unit during the final 6 months of her active service. He was careful, methodical, and possessed a quality she had always found both useful and unsettling. He remembered everything, and he never told you how much he remembered until he needed you to know. He was looking at her now the way he'd looked at classified documents, like something that needed to be assessed before it could be handled. Nurse Dawson, he said, and the word nurse carried the faint stress of someone using a term they found technically accurate but contextually incomplete. Rutherford was still standing in the doorway with the folder under his arm and the expression of a man who had made a phone call that morning, expecting it to produce leverage, and was now recalibrating whether the leverage was going to move in the direction he intended. He had found Bracken through a contact in the regional VA administrative office. That much Mara could reconstruct without being told. Rutherford had spent the better part of the morning searching for something he could use to formalize her removal from Dorian's case, and what he'd found instead was a thread that, when pulled, had produced a man from Naval Intelligence standing in a veterans hospital recovery suite in civilian clothes at 11:40 on a Tuesday morning. Rutherford had wanted a personnel problem. What he'd gotten was something he didn't have a procedure for. I'd like to speak with Nurse Dawson privately, Bracken said. This is my facility, Rutherford said, with the automatic precision of someone who needed to establish that fact before anything else was decided. I understand that. Bracken's tone was not unkind. It was simply final. Captain Voss, if you could give us the room. Dorian didn't move immediately. He looked at Mara with a directness that asked a question without phrasing it, and she gave him a small nod. Not reassurance exactly, more an acknowledgement that this was her situation to manage. He left. Rutherford left with him, which surprised her slightly, and then it was just Bracken and Mara and Flint, who had not moved from his position against her leg and showed no interest in doing so. Bracken looked at the dog for a moment. Then he pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from her in the unhurried way of someone who had decided this conversation was going to take as long as it needed to. "You look well," he said. "You're not here to tell me I look well." "No." He set the folder on his knee but didn't open it. "We've been looking for you." "I wasn't hiding. You changed your name." "I used my mother's maiden name. That's not hiding. That's paperwork." Bracken studied her. "You left a forwarding address with 3 different agencies and then moved 18 months later without updating any of them." "I moved for a job. I'm a nurse. Nurses move for jobs." "Mara." He said it flatly, without inflection, the way you say a name when you want someone to stop performing and look at you directly. "We're not here about the name, or the address." She waited. He opened the folder. The document on top was a photograph, printed, not digital, which told her something about how carefully this had been handled. It showed a building she recognized, even though she hadn't let herself think about it in 3 years. A concrete structure in a geography that the photograph didn't name. Rubble along the eastern wall. Blast scoring above the second-floor windows. "Operation Ironfield," he said. The name moved through her like cold water. "The after-action report was finalized 14 months after you left the program," Bracken said. The version that was submitted classified 3 things. The identity of the medical specialist who managed triage during the breach, the survival outcome data for the personnel recovered, and the handling records for the working dog assigned to the unit. Flint's ear moved. One of those involuntary micro-responses that working dogs produce when they catch a frequency in the human voice that the human isn't aware they're broadcasting. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mara asked. "Because the report is being unsealed." He looked at her steadily. "There's a JAG review of the mission records. It's routine, or it started as routine. But 3 members of the original unit have been contacted as part of the review process, and 2 of them independently identified a discrepancy in the official record." "What discrepancy?" "The official record states that the triage operation during the breach was managed by a field medic designated as KIA during extraction." He paused. "The 2 unit members who were contacted say that's wrong. They say the medic who ran triage survived. They say she carried 2 soldiers out of that building before the structural collapse." The room was very quiet. "And then they gave a description," Bracken continued, "that matches you closely enough that the reviewing officer flagged it for follow-up." Mara was looking at the photograph. She had not touched it. She was aware of Flint against her leg, the steady warmth of him, the particular weight of a large dog choosing to remain pressed against a person because the person needs it, even when they haven't said so. "The record says I was KIA, she said. "The record says the medical specialist designated Kilo 7 was KIA during extraction. The report doesn't use your name, it uses the designation." He paused. "The designation was reassigned 8 weeks after the mission. Standard administrative process. Nobody looked twice at it at the time. And now someone looked." Now someone looked. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the door, she could hear the normal sounds of the hospital. A cart moving down the corridor, a muffled conversation at the nursing station, the elevator doors at the far end of the hall cycling open and closed. The ordinary texture of the place she had built her life in for 3 years. "What does the JAG review need from me?" she asked. "Right now, nothing official. I'm here informally. The reviewing officer, a Colonel Nadine Sutter, has not yet been told that we located you. I wanted to speak with you first." He was watching her carefully. "I also want you to understand that the unsealing process is going to happen regardless. The question is whether you're positioned ahead of it or whether it finds you." "And Dr. Rutherford?" She said it without edge, just as a fact to be accounted for. Bracken glanced toward the closed door. "Your director made a call to the VA administrative office this morning looking for information about your military background. He found my contact information through a referral chain. He believes he's initiated a personnel review that's going to give him grounds to reassign you." He paused. "He doesn't understand what he actually started." Mara almost said something. She stopped herself. I'm going to need a day, she said. You have until Thursday. The reviewing officer arrives at Cascade Point Thursday morning. She looked at him. Here? The JAG review is conducting interviews here? Captain Voss's transfer to this facility wasn't entirely coincidental, Bracken said, and his tone carried the particular quality of a sentence that had been composed carefully before being spoken. He closed the folder and stood. Flint's transfer request originated from the reviewing officer's office. She needed a mechanism to bring unit assets to a location where contact with you was possible without triggering a formal summons, which would have required more administrative visibility than she wanted at this stage. The pieces arranged themselves with a precision that was almost physical. Voss doesn't know, Mara said. Voss was told the transfer was about the dog's recovery needs. That part is true. Bracken moved toward the door, then stopped. He looked at Flint, still pressed against her leg. He found you before we did, he said. The dog. Something in his expression shifted, not quite softened, but made briefly less composed. I've been doing this work for 19 years. That's the first time I've seen a working dog serve as a locating asset, without being deployed as one. He left. Mara sat with Flint for a long time after the door closed. She didn't tell Dorian what Bracken had said. Not that morning, not during the afternoon monitoring check when she observed Flint's shoulder mobility and documented his food intake. Not during the quiet hour before the evening shift change, when Dorian sat near the window reading a mission brief on his phone while Flint slept between them. The information wasn't hers to distribute yet. It lived in the space between what she knew and what she was ready to account for. And she had learned that premature disclosure, the instinct to share a thing before you understood its full shape, created more damage than the silence it was meant to prevent. What she did instead was work. The evening shift brought 3 new admissions: a veteran with a wound infection from a recent prosthetic fitting, a Gulf-era sergeant dealing with a medication interaction that his outpatient provider had missed, and a young woman, 24 years old, 3 years out of the Army, who had come in through the ER at 9 p.m. with a panic response that had been mischaracterized as intoxication by the ER intake team. Mara caught the mischaracterization in the handoff notes, flagged it, and spent 40 minutes with the young woman before the night physician arrived, doing the kind of sitting with that the clinical notes would never fully capture. Being present in a way that didn't demand anything, that didn't require the patient to perform her distress in medically legible terms before she could receive care. The night physician was a man named Dr. Aldrich Ponte, who had been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years and had the habit, not malicious, just calcified, of treating nursing observations as preliminary data to be confirmed rather than clinical information to be integrated. He read Mara's notes, nodded in the way that meant he'd absorbed the surface of them, and produced a treatment plan that addressed the physiological symptoms while leaving the mischaracterization intact in the official intake record. Mara corrected it, quietly, through the right administrative channel, without making it a conflict. She had learned years ago that the goal wasn't to win an argument with the people who had more institutional authority. The goal was to make sure the patient file reflected the truth, because the file was what followed the patient out of the room. It was nearly midnight when she finally left the building. The parking lot was mostly empty, the overhead lights casting orange pools on the wet asphalt. It had rained while she was inside, the kind of spring rain that came and left without announcement. She was 3 rows from her car when she heard Rutherford's voice behind her. Dawson. She turned. He had come out through the side entrance, his coat on, keys in hand, and he had the particular posture of someone who had spent the evening sitting with an unresolved problem and had decided that ambushing her in a parking lot was a solution. Your friend from Naval Intelligence left me with very little, he said. He stopped 6 feet from her. He wouldn't explain why he was here. He wouldn't tell me anything about your file. He told me any personnel questions should be directed to a contact number that, when I called it this afternoon, connected me to a voicemail box for an office I've never heard of. That sounds like a Naval Intelligence interaction, she said. What are you hiding? The question was direct enough that she almost respected it. Nothing that affects patient care, she said. You had a classified military background that you didn't disclose on your employment application. My employment application asked about criminal history and relevant certifications. My certifications are accurate. My criminal history is clean. It asked about prior employment. I listed prior employment. Not all of it. She looked at him steadily. He was not a bad person. She had worked with enough bad people to have calibrated that distinction carefully. He was a person whose sense of institutional order required that the people beneath him in hierarchy were fully legible, and she was not fully legible, and that was producing in him a distress that expressed itself as accusation. "Dr. Rutherford," she said, "whatever you think you've found, I'd encourage you to wait until Thursday before you take any formal action." "Why Thursday?" "Because the situation is changing, and decisions made before Thursday may look very different after it." His jaw tightened. "I don't operate on vague timelines, Dawson. I operate on policy." "I know you do. I'm asking you to wait 3 days." She turned and walked to her car. He didn't follow, but she could feel him watching until she pulled out of the lot, and she drove the first 4 blocks without the radio on, hands at 10 and 2, breathing in the deliberate way she'd learned years ago when she needed to keep a thought from unraveling before she'd finished building it. She was back at the hospital by 6:15 the next morning. Flint was awake when she entered the recovery suite. He stood, stretched with the controlled movement of a dog, managing shoulder discomfort, and walked to her. She crouched and let him put his nose against her palm before she ran a light check on the surgical site. No heat, no seepage. The suture line clean and holding. His gait when she walked him down the corridor was marginally improved from the previous day. Dorian arrived at 7 with 2 cups of coffee from the cart in the lobby and handed her one without asking whether she wanted it, which she appreciated. "He ate better last night," Dorian said. "I know, the night tech noted it. He hasn't slept a full cycle in 6 days. He slept 4 hours last night." She nodded. Stable environment. Consistent scent. Less stimulus. She didn't add, "He trusts where he is now." It was evident enough that saying it aloud would have felt like filling a silence that didn't need to be filled. They sat in the recovery suite. Flint settled between them on the mat. "Who was the man yesterday?" Dorian asked. He said it without preamble. Not aggressive, just direct. The register of someone who had decided to ask what they wanted to know rather than build to it. "Naval Intelligence Liaison. We have history." "From?" "Service." He looked at her. "You were active military." "Yes." "Medical?" "Trauma." He was quiet, processing this against whatever framework he'd been building since the lobby. "How long?" 9 years active, 3 years reserve. Then I separated." He looked at the dog. Flint's eyes were closing again, doing the slow, incremental drift of an animal that had decided the room was safe enough for rest. "What unit?" She held the coffee cup and said nothing. Dorian nodded slightly, the small acknowledgement of someone who has asked a question and received the shape of its answer, even without its content. He didn't push. They were still sitting there when the door opened and a nurse named Carla Ibsen, senior staff, 12 years at Cascade Point, someone Mara had worked alongside without friction and without particular closeness, put her head in with an expression that was calibrated to look neutral and wasn't quite achieving it. "Mara, Dr. Rutherford is calling a department meeting at 8. He's asked for all nursing staff. I have patient monitoring at 8. He specifically said all nursing staff. Mara looked at Carla. Carla looked back with the particular steadiness of someone who knows more than they're saying and isn't sure whether saying it would help. "I'll be there," Mara said. Carla left. Dorian watched the closed door. That felt administrative. "It is. Is it about yesterday?" "Almost certainly." "Does he have grounds?" She was honest. "He thinks he does. He may have enough to put a formal review process in motion. The hospital's employment policies have a disclosure clause that covers prior specialized training. It's vague enough that it could be applied broadly." "And if he does?" She looked at her coffee. "Then I manage it. By yourself." "That's generally how I manage things." Dorian set down his cup. He looked at her with something that was neither sympathy nor pity, but was adjacent to both. The expression of someone who recognizes a habit in another person because they share it. "That's a bad habit," he said. "I know. Efficient, but bad." "I know that too." Quote. The department meeting was in the second-floor conference room, which held 14 people comfortably, and held the 17 who showed up on Wednesday morning with the slightly compressed energy of a space asked to do more than it was designed for. Rutherford stood at the front. His expression was the careful arrangement of someone who had decided to treat this as a procedural matter rather than a conflict, which meant he had already concluded the conflict was won. He had prepared a packet. That was the first signal. Rutherford prepared packets when he wanted a paper trail. The packet outlined a policy review of nursing staff disclosure requirements, with specific reference to the clause covering prior military specialization and advanced training. It was thorough. Mara had to give him that. He had pulled the original hiring documentation, the policy language, and 3 precedent cases from other regional VA facilities where similar reviews had resulted in employment status changes. He distributed it without looking at her, which was also a signal. Rutherford looked at people when he was uncertain about them. When he had made a decision, he looked at the room. "This isn't disciplinary," he said, which was the kind of sentence that meant it was. "This is a compliance review triggered by information that came to my attention yesterday through a routine administrative inquiry." He paused. "Any nursing staff member whose prior employment record is found to be materially incomplete will be placed on administrative review pending an assessment of whether the omission affects their current role scope." The room absorbed this. Mara sat in the 3rd row. She was aware of Carla Ibsen 2 seats to her left, and of the newly hired nurse to her right who was watching Rutherford with the uncertain attention of someone who had not yet learned to read these meetings for what they were. Then Dr. Ponte, the night physician from the previous evening, cleared his throat. "Can I ask what triggered this?" he said. Rutherford said, "An administrative inquiry." "Right, but inquiry into what specifically? Because if this is about disclosure of military background, I want to note for the record that 3 members of this nursing staff are veterans, and if the policy is being applied, it should be applied uniformly." The room shifted. Mara had not spoken to Ponte since the correction she'd made to his intake notes the previous night. She had no particular reason to expect this from him. Rutherford said carefully, "The review is being applied uniformly." "Then it should be applied beginning with voluntary disclosure from all staff members this morning, and not initiated by targeting one individual's file." "Dr. Ponte, I'm a department head. I'm entitled to ask procedural questions in department meetings." He looked at Rutherford with the mild steadiness of someone who had been in enough of these meetings to understand that the quality of his patience was itself a form of pressure. "Was this review initiated in response to a specific individual's file, or was it a general audit?" The silence that followed was not long, but it was specific. Rutherford said, "It was initiated in response to information received about a specific case. Then it's targeted, not general, and the policy language you've cited requires uniform application to be defensible." Ponte looked at his copy of the packet. "I'd recommend revisiting the procedural framing before moving forward." The meeting ended 20 minutes later, without the outcome Rutherford had arranged it to produce. He did not look at Mara as people filed out. She was careful not to read too much into Ponte's intervention. It was principled, but principle and consistency didn't always share an address, and she had learned not to build on ground she hadn't tested herself. She was in the corridor when she heard her name and turned to find Carla Ibsen moving through the thinning crowd toward her with the particular urgency of someone carrying information that has a shelf life. "The man from yesterday," Carla said, low and quick. "The one in civilian clothes. He came back this morning. He's been in with Captain Voss for the last 40 minutes. When did he arrive?" 6:50. Before you." Mara started moving, not running. Running in hospital corridors attracted the wrong attention, but with the focused deliberateness that moved through a crowd without touching it. She took the stairs to the 2nd floor. The recovery suite door was closed. She could hear voices through it. Not the words, just the register, Bracken's careful cadence, and Dorian's shorter responses. She pushed the door open without knocking. Both men looked at her. Flint was on his feet. Bracken had a document in his hand. Not the folder from yesterday, something else. Something with a different header that she caught only a partial glimpse of before his expression shifted into the particular stillness of someone deciding how much to acknowledge. "There's been a development," Bracken said. "With the JAG review?" she asked. "With the mission record." He looked at her steadily. "Someone submitted an amendment to the Ironfield After Action report, late last night. The amendment identifies Kilo 7 as surviving the extraction and provides a corrected outcome summary." "Who submitted it?" "That's what I'm here to discuss." He set the document down on the chair beside him. "The submission came from inside this facility's administrative system. From a user account registered to this hospital. He paused. It came from Dr. Garrison Rutherford's login credentials. The room did not move. Rutherford doesn't have clearance to access that system, Mara said. No, Bracken agreed. He doesn't. He looked at her. But someone used his credentials to access it, and the amendment they submitted doesn't just correct the outcome record. It includes a document that was never part of the official Ironfield file, a document that was sealed separately. Dorian was very still. What document? Mara asked. Bracken picked up the page and held it so she could see it. It was a scan of a handwritten note, field paper, the kind used for mission-critical communications when digital transmission wasn't possible. The handwriting was uneven, written under conditions that made clean penmanship impossible, and she recognized it before she had consciously processed what she was seeing, recognized it in the way you recognize a voice before the words resolve into meaning. It was the last communication from her unit's lead handler, written during the breach. The last thing he had committed to paper before the structural collapse. She had never seen it. She had not known it existed. She read the words from 6 feet away without moving closer because her legs had made a decision that she hadn't caught up to yet. And when she finished reading, she understood 3 things at once. That she had been carrying a guilt for 4 years that the evidence had never supported. That someone in this hospital had known this document existed and had chosen now to surface it. And that whoever had done it had used Rutherford's credentials because they wanted the document found without being found themselves. Who has access to Rutherford's login? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was distantly aware that it shouldn't have been. Bracken said, "That is an extremely good question." Flint moved from his position between the 2 men and walked to Mara. He pressed his head against her hand with the unhurried certainty of an animal that understands, in its own complete way, that the person beside it has just received news that is going to take time to become real. From somewhere down the corridor, she heard the elevator open, and the sound of footsteps that did not belong to hospital staff. The footsteps were unhurried, which was somehow worse than if they'd been rushed. Rushed footsteps in a hospital corridor meant emergency, and emergency had a protocol. Everyone knew their role. Everyone moved toward a defined action. Unhurried footsteps in a corridor meant intention. An intention that moved at its own pace meant whoever was walking had already decided how this was going to go before they arrived. Bracken heard it too. He folded the document with the quick precision of someone returning a weapon to its holster and straightened in the same motion. Dorian moved to the door. He opened it before the knock came, which meant the woman on the other side was mid-motion when the door swung inward, and for a fraction of a second she was caught off balance, not physically, but in the way people are caught when the environment responds before they've acted on it. She recovered immediately. People who held the rank she held generally did. She was in her mid-50s, in service dress uniform, the kind worn for formal visits and proceedings that required the visual language of institutional authority. Her hair was silver at the temples and cut to regulation length. She carried a briefcase and had the bearing of someone who had walked into rooms where people didn't want her for 30 years and had stopped registering the temperature of her reception as relevant information. Colonel Nadine Sutter, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Behind her stood 2 aides who had the look of people trained to be functionally invisible until they were needed. She looked at Bracken first. "You moved faster than I anticipated." "So did whoever accessed that system last night," he said. She looked at Mara. The assessment was thorough and took about 3 seconds. "Specialist Dawson." "I'm a nurse now," Mara said. "I'm aware of what you are now." Sutter stepped into the room without being invited, which was not rudeness but simple economy of movement. She set her briefcase on the chair that Bracken had been using, and the 2 aides positioned themselves just inside the door. "I need to understand what happened between 10:40 last night and 6 this morning, and I need to understand it before the hospital's director decides his next move, because right now he is sitting in his office with a legal advisor who arrived 30 minutes ago. And the combination of those 2 facts is going to produce a formal complaint within the hour if we don't get ahead of it." "Rutherford called a legal advisor?" Dorian said. "He called the hospital's general counsel. She arrived at 7:50. Sutter looked at Bracken. "The unauthorized access to the mission record system. Do we know whether it was Rutherford directly or whether someone used his credentials as a vector?" "Credentials as a vector," Bracken said. "The access pattern is wrong for someone who knows the system. Whoever got in used his login but navigated like someone following written instructions. The timestamp on the amendment submission is 10:47. Rutherford's badge scan shows him leaving this building at 10:12. So he was gone when the access occurred. 35 minutes gone. Sutter was quiet for a moment, working something through. Then she looked at Mara. Who in this facility knows enough about you to have gone looking for that document? Nobody in this facility knew anything about me, Mara said. Until yesterday. Yesterday changed that. Bracken was here. The meeting in the hallway with Rutherford. The department meeting this morning. She paused. Anyone who was paying attention to the right things would have known that something was surfacing. Someone decided to surface it faster, Sutter said. It wasn't a question. Flint moved. Not toward the door, not toward any of the newcomers. He repositioned so that he was between Mara and the largest concentration of people in the room, and he did it with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of an animal that has assessed the social geometry and made a decision. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had signaled him. He had simply looked at the room and chosen. Sutter noticed. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. A small acknowledgement, the kind that people with long experience of military working dogs produce when they see one do something that confirms what they already know about the animal. I'm going to need your full statement, she said to Mara, this morning. What does on the record mean right now? It means JAG review officially opened, with your account of Ironfield as primary testimony from surviving personnel. She paused. The amendment to the after-action report that was submitted last night, whoever did it, whatever their method, it has created a formal discrepancy in the official record. That discrepancy triggers mandatory review. I was going to open it Thursday. It's open now. And Rutherford? His legal counsel is going to claim the unauthorized access was committed using his credentials without his knowledge, which is almost certainly true, and which means the access itself is a separate investigation running parallel to the review. She looked at Mara steadily. What matters for you this morning is that the review is open and your testimony is the center of it. They used a conference room on the third floor that Sutter's aides had cleared and reconfigured in 20 minutes, table repositioned, a recording unit set up at one end, water and printed documentation arranged with the particular orderliness of a proceeding that needed to look credible when reviewed later by people who weren't in the room. Mara had been in formal interview settings before. Military debriefs, after-action reviews, the particular structured intensity of a recorded proceeding where every word was being committed to a record that would outlast the conversation. She had learned that the way you handled the first 10 minutes set the temperature for everything that followed. Not in a strategic way, not performance, but in the way that physical posture affects breathing. The position you chose at the start determined what was easy and what was effortful for the duration. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at Sutter. Begin wherever you need to, Mara said. Sutter opened the review at 9:14 a.m. She stated the case designation, the date, the names of the individuals present. Then she looked at Mara across the table. Tell me about Ironfield. Mara had told the story before, in fragments, to a debrief officer in the immediate aftermath, to a psychologist in the months after she separated, to herself in the particular repetitive way that traumatic memory assembles and reassembles itself looking for a configuration that makes sense. She had never told it in full, in sequence, to someone who had the authority to do something with it. She told it now. The mission had been a recovery operation, a compromised intelligence asset, held in a structure that had been marked as low security based on satellite surveillance that turned out to be 6 weeks out of date. The team had been 8 personnel, 6 operators, 1 intelligence specialist, and Mara, attached as trauma medical support because the asset was reported as injured. The structure was not low security. It had been reinforced in the 6 weeks since the surveillance images were taken. The breach went wrong within the first 4 minutes. She didn't use clinical language. She used the language of sequence. This happened, then this, because sequence was what her memory had preserved most clearly, the chain of events that she had kept in order because losing the order felt like losing the ability to have learned anything from it. The lead handler, a man named Sergeant Wick Talbert, was hit on the first floor during the initial breach. Not killed. She needed to be specific about that because the official record had collapsed the timeline in a way that made his death appear to have occurred earlier than it did. He was hit and down, but alive, and she had reached him inside 90 seconds of the breach going wrong. She had stabilized him, packed the wound, managed his airway, administered what she had. He was conscious. He was talking. He was giving her the layout of the structure from memory because his eyes weren't tracking well and she needed to know where the stairwell was. He was the one who told me about Flint, she said. The dog was on the second floor with two other operators. Talbot was worried about him. The explosion on the north side had destabilized the second floor, and Flint was trained for human threat response, not structural collapse. I was going to panic in a way that made him dangerous to the people with him. What did you do? You, Sutter asked. I went up. There was a pause. You left a wounded soldier to go retrieve a working dog. I left a stabilized soldier in a position of reduced exposure to retrieve a dog who, without management, was going to injure the two operators trying to keep him contained on a structurally compromised floor. She looked at Sutter. It wasn't a difficult calculation. It was a correct one. Sutter wrote something. And the dog responded to you. He responded to a command that Talbot had given me, a specific handling signal that I'd learned during the 3 months I was attached to the unit. Flint knew me. He wasn't calm. Nothing about that building was producing calm responses in anyone, but he redirected. She described the extraction. The second-floor stairwell that had partially collapsed. The two operators, one of whom had a leg injury that hadn't been apparent until he tried to descend and couldn't. The weight distribution problem of moving a large working dog and an injured soldier down a compromised stairwell in a building that was making the sounds buildings make before they make a different final sound. She described going back for Talbot. She described the structural collapse. She described the section of the building she had been in when it came down, and the section she had not been in, and the specific geography of that difference. She did not describe what she remembered from the hours immediately after. She had been told that her memory of that period was unreliable, not by a doctor, but by the debrief officer who had interviewed her, a man she had not trusted then, and trusted less in retrospect. She said only that she had been recovered by a secondary extraction team and that the information she had been given about casualties at that point had been incomplete. Talbot, Sutter said, the after-action record lists him as KIA during extraction. He was alive when I left him the second time, Mara said. He was stable. He was talking. She paused. What the document says, the one that was submitted last night, what does it say about his timeline? Sutter was quiet for a moment. She looked at Bracken, who was sitting to her right, outside the formal proceeding but present as an observer. Bracken said carefully, the document that was submitted to the mission records system last night is Talbot's final communication. It was logged by the secondary extraction team as recovered from the site. It's dated and time-stamped consistent with the period after you were recovered. He paused. He survived the initial collapse. I was found by the secondary team. The room was very quiet. The after-action record, Mara said, and her voice had a quality she was monitoring carefully. Keeping level, not through suppression, but through the particular discipline of someone who knows that losing control of the instrument means losing the ability to use it, states that he died during extraction. The after-action record, Sutter said, was written 14 months after the mission from consolidated field reports. Some of those field reports are missing from the archive. The gaps were attributed to database migration errors at the time. She looked at Mara directly. We don't know yet whether the gaps were accidental. The implication sat in the air between them like a physical object. Someone redacted his survival, Mara said. Sutter did not confirm it. She also did not correct it. She said, the review will determine what the record reflects and whether the record reflects reality. That is why we are here. The statement ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it was over, Mara walked out into the corridor and stood with her back against the wall for a moment. Not for any particular reason, just because the wall was there and it was solid, and the morning had taken something from her that she hadn't accounted for in the calculation of what she had to give. Dorian was in the corridor. He had been there, she realized, for most of the last 2 hours. She'd seen him through the conference room window when she'd looked up during a difficult section of the account, not looking in, just present in the way that people are present when they want someone to know they're there without making it about themselves. He handed her a coffee cup. It was from the cart in the lobby, which meant he had gone down and come back at some point. It was the right temperature, not hot, not cold, which meant he'd timed it. She didn't say anything about that. How's Flint? She asked. Ate the rest of his morning portion. Walked the length of the corridor twice with the vet tech. He paused. He kept looking at the elevator. He knew where I was. I know. She drank the coffee. Dorian leaned against the wall beside her with the economy of someone who had learned that standing near a person without demanding anything from them was its own form of utility. The document, he said, Talbert's communication. I need to know what it said. She had been expecting this. She had been deciding, during the last 20 minutes of the formal statement, how much of it was hers to share and how much of it belonged to a process that hadn't finished shaping itself. It exonerated me, she said, from a call I made during the extraction, a decision that I've second-guessed for 4 years. Dorian was quiet. He wrote that the outcome was correct, she said, that the sequence I followed was the right sequence, that if I had done it differently, the operators on the second floor wouldn't have made it out. She stopped. I thought he didn't survive because of a choice I made. The document says he survived the building and that the choice I made was the reason the others did. Dorian said nothing for a moment. Then, how long have you been carrying that? 4 years. By yourself? Yes. He exhaled slowly. It was not a sigh. It was the controlled release of someone managing their own reaction because the conversation wasn't about their reaction. That's a long time. It's the amount of time it took someone to find the document and do something with it. He looked at her. You don't know who did it? No. But whoever used Rutherford's credentials to access the mission record system had a specific document in mind. You don't navigate a classified archive on a borrowed login unless you know what you're looking for and where it is. She drank the last of the coffee. Someone in this hospital knew that document existed and knew where it was filed. That's a very specific intersection of information. Bracken? Bracken was surprised when the access was discovered. He hides things well, but not that well. Who else? She was about to answer when her pager, the physical pager that the hospital still used for certain emergency protocols, the kind that cut through phone signal and digital noise, went off with the flat, urgent tone that designated a trauma code. Not a patient in distress, a facility security code. She read the display. The code was for the administrative wing, Rutherford's office. They arrived at the administrative wing in 4 minutes, which was fast enough to beat most of the security response, but not fast enough to beat whatever had already happened. The door to Rutherford's office was open. Inside, Rutherford was standing behind his desk with the rigid posture of someone who has been confronted with information they weren't prepared for and has not yet decided how to respond to it. His legal counsel, a woman named Petra Olmsted, who Mara had met once at a hospital compliance event and remembered as precise and unhurried, was standing to his right with an expression that had moved past unhurried into something more carefully controlled. Across the desk from both of them stood a man Mara did not recognize. He was in his mid-40s, with the particular physical compactness of someone who had been operationally active long enough that it had become structural. He was in civilian clothes, a jacket and dark pants, but the clothes were doing the same thing Bracken's clothes always did, which was failing to disguise what was underneath them. He had a badge on his belt that Mara clocked from the doorway. Not military, federal. He was holding a document that looked, from 6 feet away, like a formal order. Who called the security code? Dorian said from behind her. Olmsted, said one of the security officers who had arrived simultaneously. She hit the facility alert when he came in. I came in with authorization, the man said, not turning around. He had a voice like a door closing, not loud, just definitive. The alert was a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding, Olmsted said crisply. You produced federal credentials in a document and informed my client that his administrative access to hospital systems was being suspended pending a federal investigation. That is not a routine interaction. The man turned then, and Mara saw his face fully. His eyes moved to her and stopped in the way that people's eyes stop when they find what they came to find. Dawson, he said. I don't know you, she said. No, but I know your record. He looked at Dorian, then at Bracken, who had arrived behind them and was standing very still in the doorway. Special Agent Roland Fitch, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He looked back at Mara. I've been investigating the Ironfield record discrepancy for 8 months. Not as part of the JAG review, separate from it. The JAG review was initiated because my investigation flagged the file. Bracken said quietly, That's not the sequence I was given. The sequence you were given was the sequence the review office was authorized to share. Fitch looked at Bracken with the particular flatness of someone drawing a jurisdictional boundary. My investigation has a different scope. The record discrepancy isn't just a documentation error. We have reason to believe that the Ironfield After Action report was deliberately falsified, not by the field reporting team. Higher. The room was very quiet. How high? Dorian asked. Fitch looked at him. High enough that when I traced the administrative chain that authorized the final report, 2 of the 4 signatories are no longer in their original positions. One retired, one transferred to a role with significantly reduced record access. He paused. The 3rd is deceased. Natural causes, 18 months ago. And the 4th? Mara asked. Fitch's expression did something that wasn't quite a pause, more a controlled stillness over a response that he was choosing not to give immediately. The 4th is the reason I'm here, he said, and the reason I needed to suspend Dr. Rutherford's system access before the legal team moved to protect it. Olmsted said sharply, My client has not been— Your client is not a suspect, Fitch said. His credentials were used to access a classified system last night. That access was not authorized by him. But the access was authorized, it was deliberate, it was targeted, and whoever conducted it did so to surface a specific document that this investigation has been trying to locate for 8 months. He looked at Mara again. Talbert's communication. You knew it existed, she said. We knew something was filed with the secondary extraction team that never made it into the formal record. We couldn't find it because it had been removed from the primary archive and the filing index had been altered. He paused. Whoever went through Rutherford's account last night found it in an auxiliary backup system that our investigation hadn't accessed yet. Why not? Dorian asked. Because the auxiliary backup system, Fitch said, with the particular precision of someone delivering a fact they find professionally uncomfortable, is not indexed to the classified network. It's indexed to a civilian medical records infrastructure, specifically the records infrastructure used by facilities in the VA network. He looked at Mara. Specifically, this facility. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. The document was stored here, Mara said. A copy of it. Yes. Fitch set his own folder on Rutherford's desk beside the order he'd brought in. Talbert's communication was recovered from the site by the secondary extraction team and scanned into their field records. Those field records were eventually migrated into the VA network as part of a veteran service documentation program. The migration was automated. Nobody flagged it because nobody was looking for it in a civilian archive. He paused. It has been sitting in the Cascade Point Veterans Medical Center document management system for 3 years. Mara heard Dorian make a sound that wasn't quite a word. 3 years? She said. In a legacy archive folder associated with a veteran's care record, filed under a reference number that corresponds to a patient who received care at this facility. Which patient? Dorian asked. Fitch looked at him, then he looked at Mara. You, he said. It was filed under your care record. Your intake documentation from when you began employment here included a veteran's medical history import. The document migrated with your records. It's been here since the day you arrived. The fluorescent light above Rutherford's desk hummed in the silence. Mara was aware of Flint, who had been walked up from the recovery suite by a vet tech who hadn't known what else to do when the security code triggered, standing in the corridor just outside the door with his full focused attention directed at her through the open doorway, reading her the way he had always read her, the way he had been reading her since the lobby on Tuesday morning when he walked across 12 feet of linoleum and made a decision that none of the humans in the room had understood yet. It came with me, she said. Yes. I've been walking past it for 3 years. Yes. She looked at Fitch. Who is the 4th signatory? The one you came here for? Fitch reached into his folder and produced a document. He placed it on the desk face up, and when Mara looked at the name at the bottom of the authorization chain, the 4th name, the one he hadn't spoken aloud, she recognized it. Not from the mission, from this hospital, from a meeting, a hallway conversation, a professional relationship that she had cataloged as peripheral and inconsequential. The kind of connection that exists in institutional environments between people who move in the same space without ever fully occupying it together. Flint made a sound in the corridor, not a bark, something lower, something that in a working dog was a specific signal, a declaration of a threat identified. Dorian turned toward the corridor. The sound of the elevator at the far end of the administrative wing cycled open, and Rutherford, who had been silent through the entire exchange, said in a voice stripped of all its administrative precision, "That's not possible. He signed off on my hiring." The elevator doors opened and Dr. Clement Waugh stepped out. He was 61 years old, with the groomed, unhurried presentation of a man who had spent decades being the most credentialed person in any room he entered. He was Cascade Point's Chief of Medical Affairs, not the hospital director, not the department head, but the administrative layer above both, the position that interfaced between the facility and the VA regional oversight structure, the role that had signed off on hiring decisions, budget allocations, departmental policies, and the clinical governance framework that Rutherford operated inside of. I was also, Mara now understood, the man whose name sat at the bottom of the Ironfield authorization chain. He walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who had received a call in the last 20 minutes and decided, in response to that call, to come down to the administrative wing rather than stay in his office. That decision told her something. People who were innocent of the thing being investigated came down to cooperate. People who were managing the investigation's direction came down to control it. Waugh's eyes moved across the room with the speed of a man doing a fast inventory. Rutherford behind the desk, Olmsted to his right, Fitch with his federal credentials and his document, Bracken in the doorway, Dorian beside the wall, Mara in the center of all of it. He didn't look at her any longer than he looked at anyone else. That was deliberate. She recognized it as deliberate because she had seen him do it before, in meetings, in corridor interactions, in the particular way he distributed his attention so that no single person could read significance into his gaze. "Agent Fitch," he said, "I wasn't informed that NCIS had an active presence at this facility." "You weren't meant to be," Fitch said. Something moved through Waugh's expression and was gone before it fully formed. "I'd like to understand the basis for the system access suspension on Dr. Rutherford's account." "Federal investigation of unauthorized access to a classified records system," Fitch said. "The suspension is procedural. Dr. Rutherford is not the subject of investigation." "Then who is?" Fitch looked at him steadily. "That's not information I'm in a position to share at this stage of the investigation." Waugh set his portfolio on the table near the door, not on the desk, not in the center of the room, at the periphery, a positioning that said, "I am not the focus here," while ensuring he remained in the conversation. It was a practiced move. Mara had watched him do it in administrative meetings, position himself at the edge of the decision space so that he could observe without being observed as observing. "I think," Waugh said, "given that this investigation appears to intersect with personnel matters that fall under my administrative authority, I should be included in any briefing going forward." "That's reasonable," Fitch said. Mara looked at Fitch. Something in his response, its smoothness, its accommodation, was wrong. Not in the way that a mistake is wrong, but in the way that a move in a sequence is wrong when you understand what the sequence is building toward. Fitch was not conceding. He was positioning. "Dr. Waugh," Fitch said, opening his folder again, "can you confirm that you were among the signatories on the Ironfield Mission After Action report finalized approximately 4 years ago?" The room temperature changed, not physically, but Rutherford made a very small movement behind his desk, a micro-adjustment of posture, a recentering of weight, the involuntary physical response of someone who has just understood something they wish they hadn't. Waugh said, with careful precision, "I would need to review the document you're referring to before confirming any specific involvement." "Of course." Fitch produced a page from his folder and held it out. He didn't walk it over. He held it at arm's length and waited. After 2 seconds, Waugh crossed the room and took it. He read it in the same way he read everything in meetings, with his expression held in a position of neutral assessment, the face of someone evaluating data rather than receiving a blow. Mara watched his hands. The left one, holding the portfolio, tightened incrementally along the spine. "I was a medical records oversight officer at the time," he said. "I signed off on a significant volume of finalized reports in that capacity. Without reviewing my records from that period, the signature is identified in our system as authorized under your personnel code," Fitch said. "The same personnel code you used when you joined the VA administrative network 4 years ago. Codes are transferred between positions. Not this one. This code was assigned to you specifically upon your transition from Naval Medical Records oversight to the VA network. It's biometric linked. It can't be transferred. Fitch took the page back. You signed the Ironfield report, Dr. Waugh. We can establish that. What the investigation is concerned with is not the signing, but the specific alterations that appear in the final version of the report compared to the field documentation it was consolidated from. Olmsted said quietly to Rutherford, "Don't say anything." Rutherford hadn't been planning to. He was looking at Waugh with an expression that Mara had never seen on him before. Not anger, not confusion, something older than both. The expression of a person reassembling a structure they lived inside and finding that the foundation looked different than they thought. Waugh lowered the portfolio to his side. "I think this conversation should continue with legal representation present." "You're welcome to contact counsel," Fitch said. "The investigation doesn't require your immediate cooperation. I want to be transparent about that. What I do need, before anyone leaves this room, is for Colonel Sutter to receive the document access logs from the last 72 hours through the official channel rather than the administrative one." He looked at Waugh. "The document access logs that your office controls." "My office controls a significant volume of the Auxiliary Backup Archive," Fitch said. "Specifically, access logs from the Legacy Veteran Records System, the one that holds the migrated field documentation." He paused. "We've requested those logs twice through official channels in the last 8 months. Both requests were returned with administrative error codes." The word administrative in that sentence carried a weight that everyone in the room could measure. "I wasn't aware of any outstanding records requests directed to my office," Waugh said. "I know," Fitch said. "That's also part of the investigation." Waugh left the room to contact his attorney. Fitch let him go, which surprised Rutherford visibly and surprised Mara not at all. You didn't arrest a man like Waugh in a hospital administrative wing on a Wednesday morning. You built the case until it was complete, you gave him the space to make additional decisions that confirmed what you already knew, and then you moved when the structure was solid enough to hold. In the corridor, Dorian walked beside Mara with the quiet attention of someone staying close to a person who has been carrying a significant amount of weight and has just had it redistributed rather than removed. "How long has he been here?" Dorian asked. "Waugh." 5 years. He was already here when I arrived. She thought about that. The specific texture of that coincidence. The way it had been invisible because it had no reason to be visible. She had interacted with Waugh the way staff interacted with senior administrators at a facility this size. Occasionally, at distance, in contexts where he was authority and she was staff, and the interaction had clear procedural parameters. She had never had reason to look at him as anything other than what he appeared to be. "He hired Rutherford," she said. "You think Rutherford knew?" No. She was certain of this, had been certain since she watched Rutherford's face in the office. Rutherford is exactly what he appears to be. Inflexible, procedural, territorial. He targeted me because I was outside his frame of control, not because anyone told him to. She paused. But Waugh hired him because a man like Rutherford is useful, not as a collaborator but as a structural feature. If anything connected to the Ironfield record ever surfaced at this facility, Rutherford's instinct to control and investigate would have activated before anyone with actual authority could direct a response. "A buffer," Dorian said, "an accidental one, which is more reliable than a deliberate one." They reached the recovery suite. Flint was already there. The vet tech had brought him back when the security situation in the administrative wing had made the corridor an inadvisable place for a post-surgical dog. He was on his rest mat, but his head was up. And when Mara came through the door, he did the thing he had been doing since Tuesday morning. He made a direct line to her and pressed himself against her leg, and the tension he was carrying in his posture eased by visible degrees. She sat on the floor beside him rather than the chair. The chair felt too far from the ground. Dorian sat on the floor too, on the other side of Flint, and the dog stretched himself between them with a long exhale that sounded, in the quiet of the room, like something releasing. "Talbert's note," Dorian said. "What exactly did it say?" She had not shared the full text with him. She had described its meaning but not its content, and she had done that partly because the content was still caught in the throat of her, the particular place where things lived that were true and necessary and not yet ready to be spoken without cost. She told him now. Talbert had written it on field paper with a pencil because the pen he carried had been damaged in the initial breach. The handwriting was compressed and uneven. She could read it partly because she'd known him long enough to know his handwriting, partly because people who are injured and writing something they believe needs to be preserved write with a particular intent that makes even difficult script legible. He had written that the sequence Mara followed during the extraction was correct, that the decision to manage Flint before attempting a second transport of Talbert had not cost him his survival window, had in fact extended it, because the dog's unmanaged threat response on the structural floor would have endangered the two operators and likely triggered a collapse sequence ahead of the natural timeline. He had written that he had told her to go, and that he had known when he said it what the calculation was. He had written that if she was reading this, it meant the document had found her, and that she should know the weight she had been carrying did not belong to her. He had written, "The call was right. You did it right. Stop holding what was never yours to hold." Dorian was quiet for a long time after she finished. "He knew you'd blame yourself," he said. "He knew me," she said. "He wrote it for you specifically." "Yes." "Which means he was alive and coherent long enough after the building came down to write a targeted message to a specific person." "Yes." "Which means the after-action report's timeline of his death is wrong." "By enough hours to be deliberate," she said. "Not a consolidation error, a decision." Dorian put his hand on Flint's back. The dog's ear moved. "Why would someone alter the timeline of a field medic's death in an after-action report?" "Because the timeline matters for accountability." She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. If Talbert was alive long enough after the structural collapse to write a coherent field communication, then the secondary extraction team had more time than the official record indicates. If they had more time, then decisions made during that window, about who they extracted and in what sequence, about what documentation they recovered, about what they reported, those decisions come under a different scrutiny than decisions made in a compressed emergency window. Dorian followed the logic. Someone on the secondary team made a call they didn't want scrutinized. Or someone above the secondary team made a call and used the report to protect it. She paused. Wall was medical records oversight. He didn't deploy. He wasn't on the extraction, but he had access to the field documentation before it was consolidated into the final report. He had the clearance to alter a timeline. What was in it for him? That's what 8 months of NCIS investigation apparently hasn't fully answered. She looked at Dorian. But Fitch said 2 of the 4 signatories moved to positions with reduced record access. That's not a coincidence. That's management. Someone was managing what each signatory knew and what they had access to verify. To keep the story clean. To keep it clean long enough. She looked at Flint. Until something found its way into a civilian archive by accident, and the document Waugh had spent 4 years keeping buried ended up in the legacy records of the facility where he'd been working for the last 5. The specific weight of that sat between them. He's been in the same building as the document he was suppressing, Dorian said, for 3 years. Did he know? The access logs will tell us. Fitch is right about that. If Waugh's personnel code appears in the auxiliary archive access history at any point in the last 3 years, we have our answer. She paused. But my read is that he didn't know. The migration was automated. Nobody flagged it. He had no reason to look in a civilian records archive for a classified field communication. Until this week. Until Bracken showed up, and the JAG review opened, and Rutherford made noise about my background. She tilted her head back against the wall. Waugh would have heard about all of it. He's the layer above Rutherford. When Rutherford called the VA administrative office yesterday morning to pull my background, that call went through channels that Waugh monitors. And Waugh would have understood what the JAG review meant, Dorian said. He had 1 day to find the document and move it before the review had legal authority to compel access to facility records. She paused. What I don't know is whether he found it and moved it, or whether someone else found it first. Someone who used his credentials to surface it, Dorian said. Someone who knew it was here and knew what it would do to the investigation if it appeared in the mission record system through Waugh's account. They both sat with that. That's not protection, Dorian said slowly. That's a trap. Yes, Mara said. Someone laid a trap using Waugh's own credentials, and Waugh walked into this building this morning to control the situation and walked directly into it. So, Fitch's team spent the rest of the morning in controlled, systematic activity that Mara observed from the edges of document requests, system access procedures, the particular administrative choreography of a federal investigation moving from preliminary stage to formal proceedings. Bracken was deeply involved in coordinating the handoff between the NCIS investigation and the JAG review, a jurisdictional integration that required the kind of careful procedural mapping that kept both Bracken and Sutter occupied through the noon hour. Waugh's attorney arrived at 11:40. She was a woman named Constance Haverford, who had the bearing of someone who had defended people in federal proceedings before and had never found it personally distressing. She and Fitch conducted a preliminary conversation in the conference room that Sutter's team had reconfigured, and the conversation ran 45 minutes and produced a temporary arrangement. Waugh would not be compelled to make a statement until the following morning, but he would not leave the facility, and his administrative access to hospital systems remained suspended. It was a small concession that looked like a significant one. Mara recognized the shape of it. Rutherford had been largely silent since the office confrontation. Olmsted had advised him clearly, stay quiet, let the federal process work, don't make statements that could be mischaracterized. And he was following that advice with the particular precision of a man who applied rules with equal rigor, whether they benefited him or constrained him. But Mara found him in the corridor outside his office at 2 in the afternoon, standing with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at a point on the wall that didn't contain anything. Dr. Rutherford. He looked at her. The expression on his face was not the one she was used to from him. It was stripped of its administrative architecture, the procedural certainty, the hierarchical calibration. It was the face of someone who had built their understanding of the environment they operated in and found out that the foundation had a specific, named flaw. I hired into this facility because he recommended it, Rutherford said. Not accusatory, just a statement of fact that needed to be said aloud to become real. I know. I've worked here for 6 years, under his administrative authority. He paused. I initiated the review of your records because I thought it was correct procedure. I thought I was maintaining the integrity of this facility's hiring standards. I know that too. He looked at her. He would have known it would trigger a response from you, from naval intelligence, that I would create noise that pulled attention to you specifically at the same moment the JAG review was opening. She waited. He used me, Rutherford said. Yes. Not deliberately, predictably. She said it without comfort and without cruelty. You were predictable in the best sense, consistent, procedural, responding exactly as someone in your role should respond to an apparent compliance issue. He didn't manufacture your response. He created conditions where your natural response served his purpose. Rutherford absorbed this. Then he said, with the careful tone of someone choosing a question they actually want the answer to, "Did you know what he was when you came here?" "No," she said. "I came here because it was a good facility and I needed work and I wanted to take care of veterans. That's the entire reason." "And you've been doing that for 3 years?" "Yes." "While he's been—" Rutherford stopped. "While whatever he was managing was sitting in the archive without either of us knowing it." She paused. "I need to ask you something." He straightened slightly. "Old habits. When you called the VA administrative office yesterday morning to pull my background, who told you to call that specific contact?" Rutherford was quiet for a moment. "Waugh's office sent a general advisory 3 months ago. A list of VA contacts for personnel verification matters. It was framed as a standard update to our administrative protocols. And the contact you reached was the one on that list?" "Yes." "That contact connected you to Bracken?" "Yes." Mara was quiet. 3 months ago. Waugh had updated the personnel verification contact list 3 months ago, routing any background inquiry through a channel that would reach naval intelligence and flag her file, which meant he had known, or suspected, for at least 3 months that something in the JAG process was moving toward her location. He hadn't been waiting for the document to be found. He had been waiting for her to be found. And when she was found, the resulting noise would, in his calculation, have surfaced the document in a context that implicated the JAG process itself, rather than his involvement in the original falsification. The sophistication of it was almost impressive. Almost. "He didn't account for Flint," she said, mostly to herself. Rutherford looked at her. "The dog's transfer was arranged by Sutter's office," she said. "It wasn't part of Waugh's calculation. He expected a bureaucratic process, an investigation, a records review, a personnel matter that he could shape from the administrative layer. She paused. He didn't expect a Navy captain and a working dog to walk through the lobby and collapse the whole sequence in 48 hours. The access logs came through at 3:17 in the afternoon. Fitch read them in the conference room with Sutter and Bracken and two members of his team. Mara was not in the room, but was told, 40 minutes later, what they contained. WA's personnel code had accessed the auxiliary backup archive on 4 separate occasions over the past 3 years. The first access was 14 months after Mara had joined the facility, timed, she calculated, to a period when a routine record system audit would have generated automated notifications about file contents in the legacy archive. He had found the document. He had found it, read it, and not moved it, because moving it would have created a record of the interaction, and moving was not the right action when he didn't yet know what the document being present meant for his exposure. The fourth and most recent access was Tuesday night, 11:43 p.m., 14 minutes before the amendment to the Ironfield mission record was submitted using his credentials. He had gone in to move the document and found, when he arrived in the archive, that the document was already gone. Someone had accessed the auxiliary archive before him, taken the document, and submitted it to the mission record system, all through his credentials, in the window between 11:20 and 11:43. WA had logged in at 11:43 to find an empty folder and an access log that told him, in system timestamps, exactly what had been done in his name. He had been in his office for the next 6 hours before Bracken arrived, sitting with the knowledge that someone had beaten him to it. Fitch told Mara this in the corridor outside the conference room while the team continued working inside. His tone was the measured, neutral register of a federal agent delivering information to a witness, but there was something underneath it. The particular quality of a person who has done a long investigation and is arriving at a point of resolution that is not quite what they expected. Who accessed the archive before him? Mara asked. The access was conducted through his credentials, Fitch said carefully. The same credentials used for the amendment submission. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one. He paused. The access pattern for the earlier entry, the one that actually took the document, is different from WA's 4 previous entries. It's faster, more targeted. Whoever it was knew the archive structure well enough to go directly to the file without navigating the index. Someone who had been in the archive before. Multiple times, in our assessment, the navigation pattern is practiced. He looked at her. We're going to need to run a full audit of access events going back 3 years. That will take time. But you have a candidate. Fitch looked at her for a moment. We have an anomaly, he said. We're going to let the audit produce the answer rather than work backward from a hypothesis. Which meant, yes, they had a candidate, and the candidate was someone Mara had not yet named. She stood in the corridor and thought about the shape of the thing. WA had found the document 14 months in and decided not to move it. Someone else had been in the archive before that, multiple times, which meant someone else had found the document first and had been watching it for longer than WA had known it was there. Watching it. Waiting for the right moment to use it. 3 years. The document had been in the archive since the day she arrived. Someone had found it and known what it was and what it could do, and had sat with it for 3 years, waiting for a moment when surfacing. It would not just exonerate her, but structurally dismantle the falsification at its source. The JAG review opening was that moment. WA's activation of Rutherford's instincts was that moment, accelerated. And whoever it was had moved 24 hours earlier than they'd planned because the situation had compressed the window. She thought about the people who had been in this hospital for more than 3 years. She thought about who, among them, had the background to navigate a classified archive. She thought about who had reason to care about the Ironfield record specifically. She thought about Carla Ibsen, 12 years at Cascade Point, who had warned her about Bracken's second arrival, who had told her about the department meeting with the particular urgency of someone who had been watching a situation and needed it to move in a specific direction. She thought about what Carla had said to her once, during a shift overlap 6 months in, when they'd been restocking the supply room together, and Mara had mentioned in passing that she'd served before nursing. Carla had not asked follow-up questions. She had changed the subject with the particular smoothness of someone who already knew the answer and had decided not to create a moment around knowing it. She thought about the way Carla had positioned herself in the department meeting, 2 seats to Mara's left, where she could observe both Mara's face and Rutherford's simultaneously. The way she'd looked at Mara afterward, not with the uncertainty of someone who had witnessed a confusing situation, but with the particular compressed attention of someone monitoring an outcome they had a stake in. Mara walked back to the recovery suite. Flint was on his feet before she reached the door. She went in and sat on the floor beside him, and he pressed his head into her hands, and she sat with the shape of the thing turning in her mind. The 3 years, the document, the careful patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right instrument to arrive, until she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to find Carla Ibsen standing in the doorway, watching her with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for someone else to arrive at a conclusion they reached a long time ago. "You found it," Mara said. Carla stepped inside and let the door close behind her. "Month two," Carla said. "I was running a records audit on the legacy system. I pulled the file by accident. Wrong reference number, 1 digit off." She paused. "I read it. I knew what it was. I knew what it meant." She looked at Mara steadily. "I spent a week trying to figure out the right way to do something with it. Every official channel I could identify either ran through Waugh's office or produced access events that he would have seen." "So you waited?" "I waited for something that would make the right moment." Carla paused. "The JAG review notification came through Waugh's administrative calendar. He marks it shared with senior staff so it looks like transparency. I saw it 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I knew it was time." "You used his credentials." "I have his credentials because I cover administrative access functions when he's traveling. He gave me the login for routine document management. He never updated the access after the last audit." Something crossed her face. Not guilt, something more complicated. "I know what I did. I'd do it again." "Why?" Mara asked. "You didn't know me when you found the document." "No," Carla said. "But I knew Talbert." She looked at Mara steadily. "He was my brother-in-law." The recovery suite was very quiet. Flint made no sound, but his attention shifted to Carla. Not threat assessment, something different. The particular quality of focus he directed at people whose significance to Mara he was calibrating. "He talked about you," Carla said, "before Ironfield. He said there was a trauma nurse attached to the unit who he'd trust with his life." She paused. "He said if anything happened to him, he hoped she knew that what she did mattered." Outside in the corridor, Mara heard Fitch's voice. His team had finished the audit. Fitch's voice in the corridor grew closer, and Mara made a decision in the space of a single breath. She looked at Carla. "You need to tell him yourself, before he gets to you through the audit." Carla's jaw tightened. "I know." "If he arrives at it through the access logs without you coming forward, the framing is different. You controlled the narrative up until now. Don't lose it in the last 10 minutes. Something moved through Carla's face. Not fear exactly, but the particular weight of someone who has been carrying a long plan and has arrived at the moment where the plan ends and the consequences begin. And the consequences are real in a way the plan never quite was. "What happens to me?" Carla asked. "I don't know," Mara said. It was the honest answer, and she gave it without softening it. "You accessed a classified system without authorization. That's a federal matter. What you did with the access, what it produced, that's going to count for something, but I can't tell you how much." Carla nodded. She had known this. She had known it for 3 years in the abstract, and for the last 48 hours in the specific. And the nod was the movement of someone who had made their peace with a cost before they paid it. She opened the door and walked out into the corridor. Mara heard her say clearly, "Agent Fitch, I need to speak with you." Then the corridor sounds shifted, the quality of attention changing, footsteps stopping, the particular acoustic signature of a conversation that was going to require a room. Mara sat on the floor with Flint for another minute. He had his head in her lap, which was not something she had invited and not something she was going to move. Outside, the hospital continued its ordinary functions. An announcement on the PA system, the roll of a medication cart, a phone ringing at the nurse's station down the hall. The ordinary texture of the place continuing underneath the extraordinary thing that had been happening inside it for 3 days. She put her hand on Flint's head. "Okay," she said quietly. Not to anyone. Just a word she needed to say out loud to make the moment real. Woe's formal interview began at 4:15 that afternoon in the conference room, with his attorney present, with Fitch leading and Sutter observing and a recording system running that would produce a transcript reviewed by people in offices that Mara would never see. She was not in the room. She was not supposed to be in the room. She was in the break room on the second floor with a cup of coffee that she actually drank while Dorian sat across the table from her, and neither of them said much, because there was a specific kind of waiting that doesn't benefit from conversation, and they had both independently learned to recognize it. Bracken came and found her at 5:40. He sat down without being invited, which was his way, and he had the expression of someone who has been in a room where significant things were said and is choosing carefully what to carry out of it. "He's not going to give them everything today," Bracken said. "Haverford is too good for that. But the access logs are comprehensive, and the amendment submission is documented, and his personnel code is on the original falsified report, and those three things together don't require his cooperation to build a case." He paused. "Fitch has enough to move forward." "What does moving forward look like?" "Federal charges for falsification of military records, obstruction of an official investigation." The two records requests that were returned with administrative error codes came through his office, and we can demonstrate he had the authority to respond and didn't. Bracken folded his hands on the table. "The question of what he gained from the original falsification is still open. We have a theory. We're not sharing it yet." "Tell me the theory anyway." Bracken looked at her with the familiar assessment of someone deciding how much honesty the situation required. "The secondary extraction team's timeline," he said. "If it's as compressed as the altered record suggests, the team was operating under conditions that would have limited what they could recover from the site. Evidence, documentation, assets. The official record says they had 40 minutes in a structurally compromised environment with active secondary threat. That's the basis for several decisions about what was and wasn't recovered. But if Talbert was alive and coherent for longer than that, then the team had more time, and decisions about what wasn't recovered looked different." He paused. "There was an intelligence asset in that structure, not the one the mission was originally targeting, a secondary asset, identified during the breach. The official record says the asset wasn't recoverable given the time constraints." Mara was quiet. "Wall was medical records oversight," Bracken said, "not intelligence, but he had a specific connection to the intelligence office that managed the Ironfield operation, a professional relationship that predated the mission by 8 years. He paused. "We think the timeline was altered to cover a decision about the secondary asset, not a medical decision, a strategic one. And Waugh protected the record because protecting the record protected the relationship. That's the theory." He looked at her steadily. "It's going to take time to prove, possibly a significant amount of time, but the falsification charge doesn't require proving the why. It requires proving the what, and the what is documented." She drank her coffee. "What about Carla?" "She came forward voluntarily. She cooperated fully. She provided her complete account before the audit identified her." Bracken's tone was careful. "Fitch will make a recommendation. It'll be taken into account." He paused. "She broke federal law. That's not erasable. But context matters in how these things are adjudicated. And the context here is specific." Mara thought about Carla sitting in that archive 3 years ago, pulling the wrong file by 1 digit, reading a dead man's last words about a woman she'd never met, and deciding, in the privacy of that moment, without any guarantee of outcome, that she was going to wait for the right moment to make it matter. It was not a clean story. None of it was a clean story. There was federal law, and there was what Carla had done with the classified access, and there was Wick Talbert writing on field paper in a damaged building about a nurse who made the right call, and all three of those things were real simultaneously, and justice, actual justice, not the version that looked good in a summary, required holding all three of them at once without collapsing any of them into something simpler. "She told me he talked about me," Mara said, "before the mission." "I know. She told Fitch the same thing." Bracken was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, and I'm aware this isn't my place to offer, I think Talbert knew you'd find a way to keep going, even without the document. He wrote the note for you, but I think he also wrote it because he understood something about you specifically." "What's that?" "That you don't stop." Bracken stood. "Not because you're exceptional, because you're stubborn. And sometimes stubborn is the better quality." He left. Mara sat with that for a moment, then almost smiled, which surprised her. The formal outcome of the JAG review didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way institutional truth usually arrived, in increments, through official language, in documents that were thorough and precise, and almost entirely devoid of the human weight of what they were correcting. The amended Ironfield after-action report was finalized 11 days after the conference room interview. It corrected the designation of Kilo 7 from KIA to survivor. It corrected the extraction timeline. It incorporated Talbert's field communication as official documentation. It noted, in the careful passive voice of formal military records, that the original report contained material inaccuracies in the accounting of personnel outcomes. Mara read it sitting at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning with coffee and the particular quietness of a house before the day started. She read it twice. The second time, she read it more slowly, not because the language was difficult, but because she wanted to give each correction its full weight. The specific experience of reading a document that had classified her as dead and watching the record put her back into existence with the same bureaucratic precision with which it had erased her. It was not cathartic in the way she had spent years imagining it might be. It was smaller than that and more real. It was the feeling of setting down something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten the weight was optional. She put the document on the table and looked out the window at the street. A dog was being walked by a man in a heavy coat who was clearly still half asleep, the dog investigating the base of every tree with the focused interest of an animal for whom the morning contained unlimited data. She watched them move down the block until they turned the corner and were gone, and then she finished her coffee and got ready for work. Waugh was placed on administrative leave pending federal proceedings on the 8th day. The announcement came through the VA Regional Oversight Office in language that described a personnel matter under review, which was the institutional version of saying everything while saying nothing. The staff at Cascade Point received it via internal memo at 7:45 on a Thursday morning. Mara was in the middle of a medication check when the memo went out. She read it on her phone between patients, processed it in the time it took her to walk from room 4 to room 6, and put her phone away. What she felt was not satisfaction. Or not only satisfaction, there was something more complicated in it. The recognition that Waugh's removal from his position was correct and necessary, and also that it would not give back 4 years, would not return to Talbert the official record of his survival, would not undo the specific harm of having a classification error follow her out of the military and into a civilian life she had built with care and some difficulty. Consequences and restoration were not the same thing, and conflating them produced a kind of false closure that she had never trusted. But Waugh was gone from the building. His personnel code was suspended. His administrative authority over Cascade Point had been transferred to a regional oversight officer who arrived on the 9th day with a systematic review agenda and the brisk competence of someone brought in to repair rather than maintain. That was real. That mattered. The federal charges were filed on the 14th day. Falsification of military records. Obstruction of official proceedings. A third charge that Bracken mentioned to her in a brief phone call without detailing. Something connected to the secondary asset and the intelligence relationship. Something that would take longer to build and would carry more weight when it was ready. Haverford would fight it. Of course she would fight it. That was the nature of these things. They moved slowly. They moved through language and procedure and the patient accumulation of documented fact, and they did not resolve in a single day or a single hearing. Mara had accepted that before the charges were filed. What she had not accepted, and then had to learn to accept, was the attention. But the internal memo about Waugh's leave had not specified the nature of the investigation. But hospitals were not sealed environments, and the specific combination of factors, a federal agent, a JAG colonel, a naval intelligence liaison, a Navy SEAL captain, and a classified military working dog, all concentrated in one facility over the course of 5 days, had produced a level of informed speculation among the staff that made the official memo largely redundant by the time it arrived. People knew something had happened. They knew it involved Mara. They did not know the specifics, and the specifics were not hers to share, but the shape of the thing had a gravity that pulled attention in her direction, whether she invited it or not. She handled it the way she handled most things, by continuing to work. She did her rounds. She managed her patients. She caught a medication interaction on the morning of the 10th day that the attending had missed, flagged it, and watched the attending receive the correction with more grace than she'd expected and less acknowledgement than the situation warranted, which was fine. Acknowledgement was not why she caught medication interactions. Dr. Ponte found her in the corridor on the 11th day and said, without preamble, I want to formally note in my department feedback that the intervention in the intake characterization 12 days ago was clinically correct and should be recognized as such. It's in the patient file, Mara said. I'm putting it in the department record too. She looked at him. Why? Because I should have put it there the first time instead of letting it sit in the patient file where only people actively looking for it would find it. He paused. And because I've been doing this long enough to know that people who are right consistently and quietly tend to be the last ones to receive formal recognition, and formal recognition matters for what comes next. She started to say that she wasn't looking for recognition and stopped herself because it wasn't quite true and Ponte didn't deserve a reflex answer. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded and moved on, which was exactly the right amount of ceremony for what had been said. Rutherford requested a meeting with her on the 12th day. He asked his assistant to send the request through the official scheduling system, which was more formal than necessary for a conversation between a director and a staff nurse. And she understood the formality as an acknowledgement, his way of marking that this was not a routine interaction and that he knew it. She went to his office at the scheduled time. He stood when she came in, which he did not generally do for nursing staff, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. And they sat down and looked at each other with the frankness of two people who had been through something together without choosing to be, and had landed on the other side of it with a different understanding of each other than they'd had at the start. The compliance review I initiated, he said. I've withdrawn it formally and had it removed from your personnel file. I know, I received the notification. I want to say it directly, rather than just administratively. He paused. He was not a man who found direct personal statement easy. She had worked with him long enough to know that, and the effort of it was visible in the slight stiffness of how he was sitting. I used policy as a tool in a way that was technically defensible and professionally wrong. The distinction matters to me even if it doesn't change the outcome. It changes something, she said. He looked at her. I'm also formally recommending you for the Senior Clinical Specialist designation. The position has been open for 4 months. You're qualified. I should have recommended you when it opened. He paused. I didn't at the time for reasons that reflect my own limitations more than your qualifications. She held that for a moment. The designation came with a scope expansion, the authority to develop care protocols, to supervise training, to influence how the facility managed complex veteran cases. It was the kind of position she had been working toward, in the background, without making a project of it, for 2 years. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He had expected that answer, she could tell, and respected it more than an immediate acceptance would have given him reason to. Dorian came to the facility on the 16th day with Flint for what was scheduled as a follow-up veterinary assessment. The shoulder mobility had continued improving steadily. Mara had been receiving updates from the vet tech every 2 days, and the numbers were good, tracking ahead of the projected recovery curve. Flint was putting full weight on the leg again. His sleep cycles had normalized. She met them in the recovery suite for the last time. Flint came to her in the way he had been coming to her since the lobby, direct, purposeful, without ceremony, and pressed his head against her hand, and she let herself hold that for a moment fully, without managing it. His next assignment, she said to Dorian, has that been determined? There's been a discussion. Dorian sat in the chair, watching the dog. The unit wants him back. He's still operationally capable on paper. The shoulder will clear full duty in another 6 weeks. He paused. But I put in a recommendation. For what? A reassignment to a training and support role, working with handlers in the early bonding phase, younger dogs. He looked at Flint. He's 7. The operational tempo for another full active deployment it's a lot to ask, and he has skills that are harder to find than combat performance. He reads people, Mara said, better than most of the humans I work with. Dorian's mouth moved in the way it moved when something was almost a smile but hadn't fully committed. The recommendation is pending, but the unit commander is inclined to approve it. She looked at Flint. The dog was looking back at her with his particular brand of complete and uncomplicated attention, the gaze of an animal that had made a decision 5 days ago and had found no subsequent reason to revise it. He found you, Dorian said, not the other way around. I know. That means something. In this work we do, when a dog chooses a person, it's not random and it's not sentimental. It's a read. He looked at her directly. He read you in 12 feet of lobby, Whatever he found, he decided it was worth staying near. She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the lobby, the feeling of Flint's gaze landing on her before she'd registered his presence fully, the specific quality of being seen by a creature that had no investment in seeing what it wanted to see instead of what was there. "I'd like to stay in contact," she said, "with him, through the reassignment process, if that's possible." "I'll make sure it is." Dorian stood, and the movement brought something with it. A shift in the register of the room, the quality of an ending that both people in it could feel arriving. He had a specific expression that she had learned over the past 2 weeks, the look he got when he was going to say something he didn't say often. "For what it's worth. And I know you're going to say you were just doing your job." "I was just doing my job," she said. "I know, I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her. "What you did in that building, what Talbert wrote, it's consistent with every other account I've been able to access in the last 2 weeks. You made a call that most people in that situation wouldn't have had the clarity to make. And then you spent 4 years holding the cost of it like it was a debt." He paused. "You didn't owe that debt, and you can stop paying it." She held his gaze and didn't say anything for a moment because the right response to that wasn't a sentence. It was the decision to actually do the thing he was describing, which was harder and more private than anything that could be expressed in the middle of a hospital recovery suite. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing him." "He brought himself," Dorian said. "I just drove." Carla's case moved through the federal review process with the particular pace of something that was being handled carefully by people who understood its complexity. She was not charged with the falsification. She had not falsified anything. The unauthorized access charge was processed under a provision that allowed for consideration of intent and outcome, and Fitch's formal recommendation, when it came, was for supervised probation rather than prosecution, contingent on continued cooperation with the ongoing WA investigation. Mara heard about the recommendation from Bracken, who called on a Thursday evening in the 4th week. "She's not going to prison," he said. "Good," Mara said. "She may lose her nursing license. The state board has an independent process." "I know." She had already looked into it. The state board process was separate from the federal one, and its standard was different, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. She had written a statement, unsolicited, submitted through the appropriate channel, describing Carla's professional conduct and clinical judgment over 3 years, the specific interactions where Carla's experience and steadiness had improved patient outcomes. It was not advocacy for ignoring what Carla had done. It was testimony about who Carla was in the work, which was a different thing and a relevant one. Whether it would matter, she didn't know. "She said something," Bracken said. When Fitch asked her at the end of the formal statement whether she would do it differently if she could, she said she would have done it faster, that she waited too long. He paused. "Fitch wrote that in the recommendation. I think it helped." Mara stood at her kitchen window with the phone against her ear and looked at the street. Different hour than the morning she'd read the amended report, different quality of light, the long amber of a spring evening, the kind that made ordinary things look briefly significant. "Bracken," she said. "Yes." "The 4th week of every month. You said the review office would provide status updates on the WA proceedings." "That's correct." "I want to receive them directly, not through the facility, directly." A pause. "I'll arrange it." "Thank you." She put the phone down and stood in the quiet of her kitchen for a moment, and then she did something she hadn't done in 4 years. She found the photograph she kept in the drawer of her bedside table, the one from the unit's last gathering before the Ironfield mission. 8 people in various states of pretending they weren't about to go somewhere difficult. Talbert was in it, grinning at something outside the frame. Flint was at his feet, ears forward, already watching. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put it on the table where she could see it from the kitchen. Not as grief, not as memorial, as evidence that it had been real, that the people in it had been real, that what she did in the building with the burning north wall and the compromised stairwell had mattered to the specific human being standing in that photograph, and that mattering was not diminished by the fact that it had taken 4 years and a Belgian Malinois and 3 days of institutional reckoning to prove it. She took the senior clinical specialist position 6 weeks after Rutherford offered it. She didn't make a formal announcement about why she'd decided to take it or what it meant to her, because those were private things and the work was public. and she had learned the difference between the two early enough in her life that keeping them separate was second nature. What she did, in her first week in the expanded role, was review the facility's intake process for veteran patients presenting with behavioral health components that had been mischaracterized as physiological on initial assessment. She found 7 cases in the previous year where the characterization had been wrong. Not egregiously wrong, not negligently wrong, but wrong in the quiet, accumulated way that systems produced errors when nobody was specifically assigned to look for them. She wrote a protocol revision. It was dry and procedural and contained no narrative of why she'd written it, which was appropriate, because protocols were not memoir. It described a more structured screening process, a consultation pathway, a documentation standard that would make the mischaracterization visible in real time rather than discoverable in retrospect. Ponte reviewed it and signed off in the same meeting it was presented. "This is good," he said, with the straightforward brevity of someone who meant it. Rutherford approved it without revision. It went into effect on a Tuesday morning, 2 months to the day after a Belgian Malinois had walked across the hospital lobby and sat down at the feet of a nurse in blue scrubs, who everyone had assumed was unremarkable. Mara was at the nurse's station at the end of a long Thursday when her phone buzzed with a message from Dorian. It was a photograph. Flint in an outdoor training environment, mid-stride, ears forward, working alongside a handler who looked about 25 and was clearly trying very hard to project confidence at a dog who was clearly and lovingly unconvinced. The caption was, "He's still judging everyone, settled in well." She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "Tell him he's exactly where he's supposed to be." Dorian's response came 30 seconds later. "He knows. He just likes making them earn it." She put her phone in her pocket and went back to the chart she was finishing, and the nurse's station settled back into its ordinary rhythm. The PA system, the soft footfall of the evening shift, the specific sounds of a building full of people who were trying, in various ways, to get better. She had spent 4 years believing that she was carrying something that belonged to her, the weight of a decision made in a burning building, the cost of a call that had been correct but had felt, in the absence of evidence, like the kind of thing that correct people did not survive making. She had carried it quietly, the way she did most things, without making it visible, without letting it stop her from working or moving or building a life that was genuinely hers. But there was a specific difference, she had learned, between carrying something and integrating it. Carrying was maintenance. You kept the weight from dropping, you moved around it, you structured your days so that it didn't obstruct the things that mattered. Integration was different. It meant letting the thing become part of the structure instead of a burden on top of it. It meant understanding that what happened in that building was not a debt she owed, but an experience she had survived, and that surviving it with her judgment intact was not luck or accident, but the result of years of preparation and the specific kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly what your job was and doing it. She had done her job. She had done it correctly. And the record, the official, amended, corrected record, now said so. That was not nothing. It was not everything. But it was the thing that had been missing, and its presence changed the shape of what she was carrying from burden to foundation, and foundation was something you could build on rather than manage around. She finished the chart. She logged out of the system. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and said goodnight to the 2 nurses covering the late shift, and they said goodnight back with the easy familiarity of people who had worked alongside each other long enough that the greeting carried its own small history. She walked out through the lobby. The evening light came through the east-facing windows at a different angle than the morning light, warmer, lower, turning the linoleum into something that briefly resembled something valuable. She walked across it without looking down, the way she had walked across it every evening for 3 years. And the automatic door opened in front of her, and the outside air came in cool and carrying the particular smell of a spring evening in a city that was still deciding whether it was done with winter. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not because she needed to, not because the moment required it, just because she was there, and the evening was there, and she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, through considerable difficulty, that standing in the available light was not indulgence but practice. And practice was how you prepared for the next thing, whatever it turned out to be. She had been treated as unremarkable by people who mistook her stillness for absence, her quiet for limitation, her decision to work without announcement as evidence that there was nothing worth announcing. She had watched institutions protect their errors and bury their inconvenient truths, and arrange their records to reflect the story that was easiest to maintain rather than the one that was true. And she had stayed. Not because she couldn't leave, but because the work was real, and the patients were real, and the thing she was doing inside those walls mattered in the specific, unambiguous way that things mattered when the alternative was someone going without care. She had stayed, and she had worked, and she had carried what she carried, and in the end, the truth had found its way to the surface, not through her own effort, but through a chain of people who refused to let it stay buried. A brother-in-law who wrote field notes for someone he trusted, a woman who pulled the wrong file in a records audit and understood what she was reading, a dog who recognized a voice in a lobby and walked 12 feet without being told to. The truth did not always surface. She knew that. She was not naive enough to believe that every buried record had a Carla Ibsen waiting next to it, or that every wrong outcome eventually found its correction. The world was not structured to guarantee justice. It was structured to make justice possible if the right people, in the right moments, decided it was worth the cost. She was not a lesson, she was a person. But if the story of the last 3 weeks meant anything beyond her own life and the specific institutional chain that had failed and then corrected itself, it was this: that the people who are dismissed are not diminished by the dismissal, that the absence of recognition is not the absence of worth, that the quiet ones, the ones who do the work without making the work about themselves, who carry their histories without displaying them, who show up and stay and do the thing correctly, even when correctly goes unwitnessed. Those people are not waiting for validation to become real. They are already real. They were always real. The dog knew. She walked to her car in the spring evening, and the door closed behind her, and Cascade Point Veterans Medical Center continued its work as it always had, full of people doing difficult things in ordinary clothes, for reasons that no official record would ever fully capture.